Matthew 2, verses 1 through 12. After Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea during the time of King Herod, Magi came from the east to Jerusalem and asked, "Where is the one who has been born King of the Jews? We saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him." When King Herod heard this, he was disturbed, and all of Jerusalem with him. When he had called together all the people's chief priests and teachers of the law, he asked them where the Messiah was to be born. "In Bethlehem in Judea," they replied, "for this is what the prophet has written. But you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah, for out of you will come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel." Then Herod called the Magi secretly and found out from them the exact time the star had appeared. He sent them to Bethlehem and said, "Go, search carefully for the child. As soon as you find him, report to me, so that I too may go and worship him." After they had heard the king, they went on their way, and the star they had seen when it rose went ahead of them until it stopped over the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they were overjoyed. On coming to the house, they saw the child with his mother, Mary, and they bowed down and worshiped him. Then they opened their treasures and presented him with gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And having been warned in a dream not to go back to Herod, they returned to their country by another route.
Well, once again, Happy New Year, everyone. It sure is great that 2020 is finally over, right? I mean, that horrible year is finally behind us, and now we can just get back to life as it was in 2019, right? Right? Oh, wait. I'm reminded this New Year's of something Ollie said to me the day after he turned 6 last month. He said, "Dad, it's so weird. I know I'm 6 now, but I don't feel very different from when I was 5. I think of this today because as much as most of us are old enough to understand that that's not how our birthdays work, with all the excitement we've been feeling for 2020 to finally end, I suspect that some of us have to remind ourselves that we may be a little surprised that it didn't work that way with the new year. COVID, still here. Social injustice, still here. Strained relationships with loved ones who voted differently or see COVID differently, still here. Happy New Year? We're not as sure, right? And yet, I do suspect that for most of us, the start of 2021 does still feel like it arrives with the feeling that something is new and that things are a little bit more hopeful. All that dust from the brutal election year is finally settling. More than anything, people are finally starting to get vaccinated. Now, let me be clear, I'm not saying that we're anywhere close to being done with the stress of COVID. That is, at the very least, still many months away. But it is almost as if we've been running a marathon and we've at least passed the halfway marker a little while ago. And if we squint, we can at least begin to make out the shape of the finish line ahead. So what does that mean? What does it mean to still be running this marathon, but to kind of feel like we're at the very beginnings of what might be starting to feel like a home stretch, albeit a very long home stretch? Is there something we need to be conscious of as we enter this stage of the race? Is there something we need to do already to be preparing ourselves for what comes after the finish line ahead? As this long anticipated end to 2020 arrives, I have bad news then, and I have good news. The bad news is that we didn't blow COVID off the planet with our New Year's party horns on Friday, which really sucks because, boy, I was sure hoping that was going to end up being the surprise cure all along. But the good news is that we're starting a leg of this journey that is filled with opportunity. Here's what I mean. Back when the pandemic started, I invited us to think of ourselves as traveling across a bridge so covered in fog that we didn't know what lay on the other side. And I don't want to be self-congratulatory here, but indeed, much that has happened since then is what we couldn't have ever anticipated, right? For instance, Phil joked, I don't know, about a month ago, that when we first suspended in-person worship services, I sent out a note estimating that we would have to take a full 3 weeks off of meeting in person. Well, what can I say? There was a lot of fog on the bridge back then. And more than that, we also couldn't yet see that there were wildfires up ahead, that the murder of a man in Minneapolis would be a potential turning point for public support for the Black Lives Matter movement, that a spontaneous invitation I gave to read a book with me would lead to the start of a racial justice committee, that we would all start wearing masks to the grocery store, that for some of us, whether or not or how our families would get together for Christmas could deeply strain our family ties like never before, or that worshiping together online, as much as it is truly missing, would come with so many silver linings, like getting to see everyone's face before, during, and after a worship service, and getting to worship and even do church committee work with AMC family members who live really far away. The foggy bridge metaphor has proven to be even truer for what we've gone through than I ever expected. Those who study and write about liminal experiences, the technical term for crossing a metaphorical foggy bridge, were right about what was coming. It was truly different from anything we could have expected. And I don't know if you remember this part, but back when we were talking about this, I also preached a sermon about how those same scholars predicted that when we cross a foggy bridge into the unknown, we inevitably encounter the opportunity to be transformed. That as you cross a bridge into the unknown, there are opportunities like never before to see what the world could look like if we put love, empathy, and generosity ahead of things like status. And again, I dare say that those scholars were right about that too. As we've crossed our bridge, the beginnings of transformation have happened. They've been there in the subtle things, like the way we see one another's faces during worship, rather than all just facing the front, seeing the back of each other's heads and placing all the symbolic status on the pastor and the other worship leaders. And they've been there in the beginnings, and the beginnings of transformation have been there in more obvious ways. Just to give one example, in seeing each other protesting on the streets for racial equality. Of course, unlike turning 6, there isn't a day when you suddenly become transformed, but the signs are there for us that this process is happening. And so, seeing as the foggy bridge metaphor seems to have been helpful for understanding so much of 2020, I wonder if it might be helpful for us again as we begin 2021. Here's what I mean. If 2020 was like traveling across a bridge so covered in fog that we had no idea where it was taking us, 2021 is the experience of starting to get close enough to the end of that bridge, just close enough that if we squint, we can start to see the outlines of where it's taking us. And when we reach that part of the bridge, the part where we can anticipate life on the other side, it's time to start asking ourselves some questions about what we want to do with all this transformation we started to experience while we've been on it. This week, Ed Young, the Atlantic magazine science writer, opened his article, Where Year 2 of the Pandemic Will Take Us, with this quote from Martha Lincoln, a medical anthropologist at San Francisco State University. She said, "I think we're in this liminal moment of collectively deciding what we're going to remember and we're going to forget," which is another way of saying we're still on this foggy bridge, but we're starting to see the signs that the end of the bridge is coming. And so now is the time to ask ourselves, what are we going to remember and what are we going to forget? Which is another way of saying, will we remember how we've started to be transformed this past year and allow ourselves to continue to be transformed when we get to the other side? Or will we forget it and leave it all behind on the bridge? As I read Young's article, here's just some of the things I saw Americans needing to ask that question about. Having seen how much harder COVID has hit Americans of color than Americans who are white, will we choose to remember, or are we going to forget how obviously our economic and healthcare system is tainted by discrimination? Having seen how political polarization contributed to high death rates, will we choose to remember, or are we going to forget that political point scoring has a measurable human cost? Having seen what a pandemic can do when we have not prepared ourselves to be ready for it, will we choose to remember, or are we going to forget to prepare for the next one? Out of sight, out of mind. Having watched our healthcare workers, our doctors, nurses, respiratory therapists put themselves and their families at risk every day to care for, and all too often lose, patient after patient in overcrowded and endlessly demanding conditions? Will we choose to remember, or will we forget about what happens when we take our healthcare workers for granted? Having seen 4 times as many women as men leave the workforce when school closures forced families to choose between someone's job and their child's education, will we remember, or will we forget this evidence that gender equality is definitely not a thing of the past? Having failed to come together to face this pandemic as a united front, will we remember, or will we forget that a doctrine of individualism can grow so powerful that our right to it becomes greater than everything and everyone else? Having seen our country, with all of its resources, struggle to contain the virus, as well as countries with much, much fewer resources, because their healthcare systems invest in preventing illness, while ours fixates mostly on treating illness. Will we choose to remember, or will we forget what happens in countries that underfund public health? Having learned about the growing number of COVID long haulers, will we join them in continuing to remember the long-term effects of this pandemic, or will we forget about their pain because we can? As Young puts it in his article, there is a likely future in which America's immune system learns lessons from COVID-19, but its collective consciousness does not. Now, clearly, Young is kind of pessimistic, is more concerned that we will prioritize forgetting over remembering. And it's not hard to imagine why. If we go back to that foggy bridge metaphor, the truth is that when we get to the place on the bridge that we're at today, where the other side of the bridge comes into view, what we see over there has the potential to look a lot like what we left back on the starting side of the bridge. We're going to start squinting ahead and begin to see our church building filled with each one of us again. We'll squint ahead and begin to see our home filled with old friends again. We'll squint ahead and begin to see our calendar filled with all of its old activities, soccer practices, annual trips to see families, our favorite sports team's schedule, date nights to restaurants. We'll squint ahead and begin to imagine everything going back to normal again. And we'll naturally long for that so deeply that we'll want to arrive at the end of the bridge with as few memories of what happened on that bridge as possible, wanting to just desperately go back to exactly the way life was before. But, after the Magi had completed their journey into the unknown, after the Magi had met Jesus, the ultimate Christian shorthand for experiencing transformation, and as the Magi fixed their gaze again on returning home, they too had to decide if they would remember or forget. Would they go back the way they came, the way that was likely the most direct, the way that they already knew, the way that would keep them on good terms with a dangerous ruler? Would they remember that this baby they had met was the new king, offering a new direction for them? Or would they rush back to doing things according to the status quo? The Bible makes it about as clear as the pandemic has. The question of whether or not the Magi remember or forget their transformation has life or death implications for what God is doing in this world through Jesus. They can go home the way that is most comfortable for them. They can go home without upsetting the established power imbalance. Established power, yeah. But what the angel makes clear to them is this: if they do, they will have to confront the fact that they are abandoning, they're forgetting Jesus, and instead contributing to his probable death. As 2021 begins and we start to glimpse what lies ahead for us in this final leg of our journey, we don't need to feel guilty about being excited about seeing much ahead that looks like home. Singing together, hugging each other, sitting in each other's homes again, so much more. But we do have the opportunity right now, as we begin this critical leg of the journey, to already decide right now, as we begin to transition towards home again, will we do so in a way that remembers how we have begun to be transformed, or will we begin to give in to our tendency to want to forget? This may at first sound like a heavy burden, but I invite us to think about those Magi traveling home. When we picture them, do we mainly picture travelers burdened by the need to go home differently? Or do we picture travelers so transformed that they are inspired to be on this new journey ahead? Here at AMC, if we stop at this critical moment in our journey to take stock of how we have begun to be transformed this past year, I suspect that we may realize that we have good reason to feel much like the latter, like those Magi headed home, not so much burdened, but inspired to be coming home transformed. In this past year, we have experienced new possibilities for how we relate to one another when we gather for worship. In this past year, we have experienced new possibilities for how we relate to one another throughout the whole week. In this past year, we have experienced new possibilities for how we continue our relationships with AMC family members who live far away. In this past year, we have taken important next steps on our journey towards racial justice. In this past year, we have heard the call to begin talking to one another about offering a clearer welcome to the LGBTQ+ folks in our church family. In this past year, we have heard regular reports from Claire that have allowed us to appreciate our healthcare workers more fully. In this past year, we have learned a prayer from Chris Nord that can help us to begin to detach ourselves from political polarization. In this past year, we have, as a congregation through COVID, learned that we know how to come together, to be united when faced with a challenge that has divided many, including a large number of churches much like ours. In this past year, we have experienced the beginnings of a lot of transformation. So yes, when Ollie has his next birthday, just under 1 year from now, he may well turn to me and say, "Dad, it's so weird. I know I'm 7 now, but I don't feel very different from how I felt when I was 6. But nevertheless, the truth is going to be that he will be very different, will have grown a lot from who he was on that day he turned 6. When we get to 2022, it could well be the same for us. We could look back to the start of 2021 and say, wow, even if we haven't always noticed each moment of growth along the way, we have grown a lot since then. Of course, unlike Ollie's growth, which will happen whether Shanda and I like it or not, we as a church family will have to choose to continue our growth. And today might be exactly the day to make that choice. As we begin 2021, as the beginning of the end of the pandemic feels like it's starting to come into view, will we be a people who remember or forget? Will we give in to the pressures to go back to the status quo, or will we continue to be transformed? Will we listen to Herod, or will we listen to the angels? Will we choose the same old route we were on before, or will we embrace the challenge and the opportunity to go home by another way?